Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson, and my guest today is kind of a big deal, right? He's a professor of history at Northwestern University. His first book is called Thinking Small, The United States and the Lure of Community Development. But you probably know him from his second book, which I'm not kidding you. I'm not blowing smoke. So far, this is the most important English language book written in the 21st century. If you question that, I'm happy to explain. It's called How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. And even though we're not here to talk about how to hide an empire today, he displayed talents in that award-winning book, including an eye for puncturing bullshit narratives that were brought to bear on two things that we are going to talk about today, because my guest has a piece out in the Guardian Long Reads section, which they're not op-eds, they're longer, more deep read, like 6,000 word essay type things. And he's also got a fascinating chapter in a new edited volume about ideology and U.S. foreign relations. Let me pull the screenshot of the book up. Right. Edited by Christopher McKnight-Nichols and David Milne. Very good edited volume. I can't say that about all edited volumes. And so the Guardian essay is called Are We Really Prisoners of Geography? And the book chapter is called The Galactic Vietnam, Technology, Modernization, and Empire in George Lucas's Star Wars. The guy I'm talking about is the one and only Daniel Immerwahr. Welcome to the show, man.
Ben, thanks so much for having me. You said if anyone has questions about your grandiose claims about the book, they should ask you. I won't force you to answer them, but I had questions about some of those claims. Anyway,
for another time. Yes.
For another time.
So when I read that Guardian essay, Are We Really Prisoners of Geography, which I read multiple times, I thought to myself, like, this guy really gets it, because I come from the world of the geopoliticians. There's a lot of limits on what I can say about that world because of NDAs and classification and stuff. But a lot of it is an intellectual grift. And you saw that for what it is, and you kind of put it on blast. And so I had to get you on here to talk about it, because in that essay, you're overturning a lot of like Beltway conventional wisdom about geography as destiny kind of shit. And you do it through like a very fair, but ultimately damning review of geopoliticians themselves, and like what they claim. There are these guys who are writing big vacuous airport bookstore books. They are bestsellers, and yet there's a whole lot of smoke. There's a whole lot of bullshit there. What prompted you to write this? Is there a backstory?
Yeah, my editor at The Guardian was the one who initially asked the question. He noticed this, and I think it's actually more prominent in England where he works than in the United States. He noticed that, the airport is just increasingly, I don't say dominated, but occupied, alert to a set of books, all of which have sort of crept onto the bestseller list that have titles like Prisoners of Geography, Geography as Destiny, that basically seem to make the claim that we are creatures of the topographical features of the world around us. And it's not a totally new way of thinking, but it seems to be a newly popular one, both in terms of its ability to command wide audiences and also in its ability to get taken seriously in the halls of power.
Yeah, totally. So there's many ways to define geopolitics, and you describe it as a set of theories that says what's under our feet directs what's in our head. So just to set things up, can you sort of introduce the origins of geopolitics with Alfred Mackinder and the linkages to imperialism and Nazism?
Sure. So we often use that word geopolitics in a loose way to mean international affairs, or perhaps international affairs considered in a kind of realist way. But more properly, it refers to a way of thinking about international affairs that stresses the shaping feature of the physical properties of the earth. And on the one hand, it's clearly correct that we are creatures of our environment. I mean, I can't imagine denying that fact. But there's a particular strain of international relations that tries to explain why countries, you know, basically sees the world as division divided between rivalrous powers, and the point of those being one of those powers is to increase your position. And a lot of those questions of how do you do that, or how do you assess and increase your position, are all measured on the map, and particularly on the relief map that shows you, you know, ridges and flat lands and that kind of thing. It's basically a way of seeing the world like the game, like a big game of Risk. And in fact, Risk was designed to exemplify the principles of geopolitics.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so you drew some parallels between geopolitics and Marxism early in the essay, but you also described geopolitics pretty clearly as kind of like a mind palace for reactionaries because of these
Yeah.
historical, like where it comes from was the context of imperial competition. Um,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
so like,
So
what's all that about?
yeah, yeah. Let's get into that. The way in which it is like Orthodox Marxism is that it is a monocausal theory. And look, we have to acknowledge that Marxism is very complex and has grown florid, and it's rare that you'll find a
Highly
Marxist who
variegated
says
now.
all
Yeah.
that matters is class struggle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is also true that a lot of people who dance with geopolitics have really sophisticated understandings of complex interactions between features of the planet and you know, political arrangements that we've made. But it is interesting that the sort of we are seeing a return, especially on the bestseller list, to some fairly reductionist geopolitics. I call them rocks reductionists, where they're just like, all you have to do fundamentally to understand what a country is about is to stare very hard at the map, because everything else is epiphenomenal and everything else is superstructure. Everything else, culture, language, ideas, you know, shared ethnicity, all that kind of stuff doesn't really matter, because in the end of the day, when a leader makes a decision, it is just about
He's
resources,
staring at
access
that
to those
mountain. Yeah.
resources. Yeah, exactly. Right. No, no. And so that was, I mean, that was actually a really important mode of thinking in the imperial age. And this guy that you briefly mentioned, Halford Mackinder, what is sort of considered not the founder, not the first, but a central, absolutely central figure in the
Mhm.
geopolitical tradition. And he wrote his famous essay in 1904 that was like right in the heyday of the British Empire. And he's thinking, I mean, he is an imperialist, but he's also thinking like an imperialist, just sort of gazing at the map, like figuring out where you can get access, where you might be cut off, what that might mean. And in his case, he's imagining the end of Britain's ability to command the world by commanding the seas, and he's imagining a kind of return to land wars.
Mhm.
And then wonders, you know, when you're talking about land wars, you have to think really carefully about what the land looks like. That's the thought, at least.
What was it that the Nazis found in Halford that was so attractive?
Yeah, it's interesting because Mackinder is worried about the loss of British power, and he ends up thinking that there's going to be this sort of grand struggle between land powers and sea powers.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets very interested in the interior of Eurasia, which he calls the heartland. And then he has this famous dictum, you know, he who controls East Europe controls the heartland. He who controls the heartland controls, you know, the world. I may be missing a term in there, but it's basically that.
That's right.
Um, and that's fear. He's speaking out of fear, right? He's like, Britain is not well positioned to do any of those things. And interestingly, the Nazis, and by the Nazis I mean like Adolf Hitler personally, get very interested in this kind of thinking and take it not as a warning, but take it as advice. They're like, oh, he who controls Eastern Europe controls the heartland. He who controls the heartland controls the world.
There we
That
go.
sounds like a plan.
Yeah, baby.
Indeed, it is a plan. I want to pause and just talk about something else you said, because you said this is kind of a mind palace for reactionaries, and that's true not just because of the genealogical connection between imperialism and Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
It is true for another reason, that and it's actually really clarified by the distinction with Marxism, because if you think about what Marxism is, Marxism, you know, in the kind of most simplistic way, says that class struggle is what drives history.
Yeah.
And that's a conflictual kind of understanding that privileges, you know, insurgents from below, right? That they are the form of the class struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Geopolitics, in its most reductionist form, says that the map determines history, and the map is unchanging. So in some ways, it becomes an apology for power or for the existing arrangements. And in fact, a lot of the geopolitical wisdom that we're seeing in these bestseller books is of the kind of just saying, you know, the United States was fated to lead, or, you know, there will always be trouble in this part of China. It's that kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's kind of appealing to I don't know what you would call it, like a conservative impulse. Like it's an advice to princes
Yeah.
idiom. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not just an advice to princes, an advice to princes that does not imagine that much is going to change. So really, the advice is about how to hold position,
Yeah.
um, and it tends to work better as advice to powerful princes.
Yeah. Status quo bias for princes or something. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's right.
So who the first of these guys? Not an American, I don't think. Tim Marshall. Who is
Yeah,
he? What is he about? He says a lot of stuff about Russia.
he's a journalist, and he's been, had a terrific career recently. He has a series of books. I think he's up to four now on geography determining our world. And the reason it's a series is that they've sold incredibly well. They've particularly sold well in the UK. And he'd been one of these sort of globetrotting journalists, and then he came back with this message. He's like, actually, when you really are on the ground and you have boots on the ground in all these places that I've been and you've been shot at, and he has all these stories to tell, you realize the destiny defining feature of the physical properties of the planet. And I want to just say that there's something right about that, that Marshall, I think, was responding to a kind of glib globalization, the kind that we associate with Thomas Friedman and his book The World is Flat.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that technology and globalization are going to be a sort of are going to mean that territory doesn't matter anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And Marshall was, and is not the only one, responding critically to that, so that you can see this as a kind of reaction to the utopian dreams of globalization, and a lot of it is a reassertion of the grim and unchanging realities of the map. And so Marshall's been a huge deal in the UK, less of one, but still kind of sells pretty well in the US. And he's sort of just like a Jared Diamond type figure.
Yeah, I mean, so like global trade, McDonald's peace theory, flat, not flat Earth, world is flat, like that kind of view I mean, it really took off in the '90s, I guess. But that view, it's not, it's not correct, but it's not completely wrong either. But it seems like these guys, and in particular Tim Marshall, are benefiting from the fact that we know the globalization narrative is either bullshit or incomplete. Like McDonald's
Yes.
peace theory
Yes.
doesn't predict everything, right?
Yeah. So I think that's the most compelling part of this geopolitics stuff. And there's a good book by Robert Kaplan called The Revenge of Geography
Mm-hmm.
that really lays out an intellectual history, right? That says, we had this brief moment in the 90s and the early 2000s where it seemed like, spatial problems were ultimately resolvable with technology.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a giddy, hopeful moment and perhaps a naive one. And geopoliticians, I think, are right to call out the naivete of that, and they're right to say that globalization hasn't been exactly the happy story that we all hoped. What's weird is that for them the answer is then to go right back into the 1940s, right? Then the analysis has to be, well, the thing that really matters is territory and resources, and it's a very grim outlook. It might not be wrong. To say it's grim isn't to say that it's wrong, but it
Yeah.
is to say it's a it's not one that makes a lot of room for hope.
Yeah. You point to a bunch of examples that show how what did you call it? And the environmental determinism, but you said like rock reductionism.
Rock's
I guess?
reductionism. Yeah.
Like there's ways in which it really invalidates itself when you take it too far, or when
Yes.
you do the grifter version of it. Can you talk
Yeah.
about how it figures into stuff like Gulf War One?
Yeah. So, and I think before we even get to the Gulf War, you're right that, like any theory, if you take it too far, it starts to get stupid. And
Mm-hmm.
if you take the stupid version of it, it's particularly the grifter version of it, as you say, it starts to get a little wobbly. What we're seeing right now isn't what's new. Isn't just the idea that the environment matters. Like that's
Of course, yeah.
inarguably true, right? But what we're seeing is the kind of enough momentum for this theory that we're really getting a lot of wind in the sails of real, like, geopolitics grifters,
Yeah.
who are, I think, not especially well informed, but writing with maximal confidence and in a kind of hand wavy way. And we can talk about that aspect of it. I think grifter is not the wrong word for this sort of set of writers. Yeah, and one sorry, let's just now talk a little bit about how we got here, because the Gulf War is really important.
Yeah.
There's a few things that happened in the 90s that really made it seem like the Thomas Friedman world is flat view of things was correct, or was increasingly going to be correct.
Yeah.
One of them was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the kind of, sudden, efflorescence of world trade with the World Trade Organization, all these regional trade agreements. And another one was the Gulf War, which started out as a totally, typical World War II style tank war, a land invasion in Eurasia, a border crossing war for resources. And Saddam Hussein had amassed, shockingly, the world's fourth largest army to fight this war. I mean, that is a kind of implausible fact that, like, we had to check like 5 times to make sure we were
Yeah.
getting it right, but it's true. And thought, okay, well, this is, Kuwait is a smaller country. It has a lot of oil.
Mhm.
Iraq can take it over, and then Iraq will have that oil. And then and Saddam Hussein had every reason to think that if it was a land war, that he was actually quite well equipped to fight it, literally well equipped. And then something happened,
Because
which
of the
was
desert, right? I
unexpected.
mean,
Yeah, it's not just because of the desert, but like he had like this whole system where like the tanks would hide at night under the desert, like buried, semi-buried, and so you couldn't see them, and then they would like come out all at once. I mean, it was actually effective, like very like, or it seemed like it was going to be very effective. And Saddam Hussein took himself to be preparing for what he called the mother of all battles. If I am resisted in this. Um, and it wasn't. It was the stepchild of all battles. And the
yeah.
reason it wasn't was that the United States came in. I mean, it took a while to set it up. It flew all this material over to Saudi Arabia, set up bases there, but then it basically fought it as an air war.
Yeah.
And
Smart
and it turns out
bombs.
that yeah, well, and including those like tanks that were semi buried in the sand, you couldn't visually see them, but if you had infrared bombs, they were highly visible.
Yeah.
So just like plink, 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 like there go the tanks, one by one. And the entire war substantively took about 100 hours. I mean, the land war took about 100 hours, but basically after the air war had started, Iraq's infrastructure was already knocked out like within hours. So it was suddenly, it was like that moment in like Star Trek Wrath of Khan where they're like, oh my God, we're gonna like, how are we gonna deal with this? Like Khan's ship is so powerful. And they're like, wait, Khan is like expecting this to happen in 2 dimensions because he's used to sea power. What if we come in from above? What if like he's not expecting the third dimension? And it was
Yeah.
like the third dimension of warfare. It was suddenly a moment. Why is this important? Because it was a moment when it suddenly seemed like the territorial materiality on the ground part of war wasn't going to matter as much because you could just launch it from the air. And in fact, some of the bombers that the United States sent to Iraq lifted off in Louisiana. Do you
Yeah.
understand? Like they lift off in Louisiana, they bomb Iraq on schedule and accurately, and suddenly you're just like, okay, it doesn't matter what part of the planet you control. The skies are open to everyone. Everything is air linked to everything else,
What is a
and
battlefield
all.
anymore? Yeah.
What is a battlefield, right? And in fact, military, theorists are kind of increasingly don't talk about the battlefield, which is, if you think about it, as a spatial descriptor and a metaphor. They talk about battle space,
Yeah.
And that's much more metaphorical because it includes cyber and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it felt like a moment of the dematerialization of war, just at the same time as trade was sort of dematerializing all the like economic barriers that had riven countries in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah. Yeah. What about you go on at length with the example of Dubai, which was another way
Yeah,
in which like the map is not so immutable, or like if the map is your source of prediction, then you can go wrong, very very wrong. So what's
yeah,
the deal with
yeah,
Dubai?
yeah. The central claim in a lot of this sort of geography is destiny, prisoners of geography, revenge of geography literature is that that the map kind of ultimately is the source of politics, and B, that the map doesn't change, right? And that's why it becomes a kind of conservative doctrine.
Mm,
And that's kind of true. Mountains don't tend to change, but there are actually a lot of features of our planet that do change, and or a lot of spaces that are malleable that afford many uses, or can change in their significance in terms of technology. And the example that I give is Dubai, which is completely unpromising as a hub of global capital If
Yeah.
you were to think of where that would be located on a map, it would not be Dubai. If you were to think of where is going to be the tallest building on the planet, you would absolutely not say Dubai. And it is Dubai. And it's not even for the reason that you might first assume, which is oil. I mean, Dubai had oil, past tense, but it is less than 1% of its economy, of its GDP.
Mm.
Now, oil sales are. Dubai has remade itself in non-material ways. It is a logistics hub, and that has a lot to do not with its physical landscape, but with its legal landscape.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of things it allows and how it allows them and how it kind of divides up its space. And then once it had sort of achieved really extraordinary success for non-physical reasons, then it was able to remake its physical landscape. So Dubai has, the largest harbor in the Middle East, which you might think a lucky geographic fact, invade Dubai, but actually it turns out that harbor, like a deep, really good harbor, was dug out of the desert. That was like
They made
desert
that shit.
lands. Yeah, and that takes a lot of stuff. But Dubai, all of Dubai looks like that. I mean, it is peppered with artificial islands that have been, with land that has been dredged up from the harbor. So it's a reminder about how much we can remake the planet. And okay, you might say, well, Dubai's a limit case. It's not actually that large, and so yes, you can do this kind of thing, if you put enough resources into it. But most countries can't afford that, and most countries are far larger. But it's actually a pretty good sort of symbol in some ways, because we are terraforming our planet in very large ways, not with the kind of purposefulness of Dubai, but that's what we've done with climate change. We are changing the meaning of land. We are changing the physical properties of land. We are, rivers are going into dust, and so that premise of the geopoliticians that geography is unchanging, I mean, that seems completely in doubt today.
Yeah, I mean, in the fever dreams of conservatives that look on at Asia too, like China's artificial island building in the South China Sea
Yeah,
is
good example.
threat object, number 1 or 2, and
Yeah.
it's not immutable. Obviously, it wasn't there a few years ago. Like,
Yeah, and those the geopoliticians will say, and I think this is right. Like they'll be like, okay, if you want to understand Chinese policy, you just have to look at a map really hard, and you'll see this is where Taiwan is. This is like China's like trade routes. Like Taiwan is like physically in the place it needs to be,
mm-hmm.
that China needs. So that's why it cares so much about controlling Taiwan. And that's not uncompelling. But then you make the point that it turns out that we now have the capacity to make islands, and China is making islands, and that changes things. That change literally, China can change the map.
Yeah. You'd think that a worldview obsessed with geography would take seriously environmental degradation, but the geopoliticians say like very little about the climate crisis. Why do you? What is that about?
It's so bizarre. I read
Huge blind
10
spot
of these books like back to back, and it's really, I mean, it's not that no one ever mentions climate change, but it really is remarkable, the absence of that in a lot of these books. And it's strange because I think that a normal take would be we are absolutely shaped by our environment, and that is why global warming is such a threat.
Yes.
But that's not what you get from geopolitics. You get we are absolutely shaped by our environment. Our environment is unchanging, therefore our social structures are unchanging.
And therefore imperialism is
form,
essential.
yeah, or something. I mean, they never quite say that, but
it's not fashionable.
But they sometimes brush up against it. So yeah, it's funny, and I think that has to do with the not the, so one proposition is environment matters, and that I think we can agree on. The other proposition, I think it's the proposition about mutability that makes it hard for geopoliticians to take that seriously, because they kind of imagine a world of static politics that is derived from a static map. And I think the world that we're living in has a volatile map, and I think that leads us to kind of an analysis where we will need to accustom ourselves to a lot of political dynamism.
Yeah. It's the map itself can change. There was also, you hit on it a little bit in the essay, the way we assign meaning to these material realities also is obviously highly mutable. I mean, it should be taken as a given that like how significant something, it's only like a mountain only becomes a terror object when you put yourself in a worst case scenario where it is in fact a terror object. I mean, like it's not inherently so.
So, I mean, I think one of the attractions of the geopolitical worldview is that you're always preparing for the worst case scenario. That politics ultimately is about,
Mhm.
peace is just preparation for war. When it comes down to it, these large grand strategic decisions have to take into account, um, worst case scenarios at all times.
Yeah.
So that's why geography becomes so important, is that you have to imagine all trade breaking down, all systems breaking down, and then you're just, left with your own devices, and then you're left surveying like what you literally have within your borders physically. um, look, I don't want to totally dismiss that. I mean, global leaders have thought like that at various times, but it does express a kind of deep skepticism toward technology, culture, and ideas that I'm not sure is warranted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I suspect is connected to a conservatism about politics that I don't share.
Yeah, I mean the you when you did the Mackinder quote at the top about Eurasian heartland and like he who
Yeah,
controls that 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 exact template of a sentence gets used all the time to talk about modern foreign policy, modern international relations. Like I can't tell you the number of constructs where I've heard like if Vietnam goes, then the entire Asian map goes. If
yeah, yeah,
Taiwan
yeah, yeah,
goes
yeah,
down, we lose Japan
yeah.
too. That's the current one, right? And it's like it's always like if this key is unlocked, then everything goes to shit.
Yeah, and it's so often the way that's expressed, and this is from Mackinder, is that these places are pivots, the pivot of world history,
Your
the
quotes.
pivot of.
Can I quote that real quick?
Yeah,
I
sure.
pulled that out. You in the essay you say, "quote Will Turkey become the pivot point for Europe, Asia, and Africa, as Stratfor founder George Friedman contends? Or perhaps India will become the global pivot state, as Kaplan believes, adding that Iran is the most pivotal geography of the Middle East, Taiwan is pivotal to maritime Asia, and North Korea is the true pivot of East Asia." It was a terrific paragraph.
Well, it's really the pivot of that whole paragraph,
Yeah.
also.
Thank you. That was good.
Possibly even of the entire Guardian. Yeah, yeah, I mean, it. Look, let's unpack that a little bit. So, I mean, first of all, the just counting up the usage of the word pivot in these writings. I mean, it gets comical at a certain point, but yeah, it doesn't. So, first of all, it kind of it 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 speaks to a sort of connoisseurship that geopoliticians are peddling,
Mm-hmm.
where they're like, okay, like you look at a map and you just think these are a bunch of places, but I actually see that this one place turns out to be the key to the whole thing. And
Connoisseurship
then
is a good word.
often,
Yeah.
and then often it's either a key because it has to be controlled. Like currently, it cannot, the status quo has to be maintained there, otherwise chaos will ensue. Or that this is like how you seize world powers. You seize this one place. He controls East Europe, whatever. And that's an interesting way to think about the world, right? Is to think about like what are the places that if you control them, you get the whole thing. But I think that's very much how Mackinder writes, and interestingly, that's a part that we're seeing a lot of from modern geopoliticians.
Yeah, there's something inherently. This is where the grift part comes in a little bit. There's multiple dimensions to that claim, but a little bit is like it's inherently seductive and appealing to people who have to manage policy and manage risk to
Yeah.
say, here's a point of leverage. Here's a point. We're constant, like policymakers are always looking for points of leverage,
Yes.
like where's the disproportionate bang for the buck? And like,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's what they're claiming, even though it's, I mean, not correct. That's actually a question I had too. Like, can you talk about the track record of some of this stuff when it comes to predictions and like policy advocacy?
Yeah, it's a little hard because some of the predictions can be quite vague. Some of them are long term,
Yeah.
um, and some of them are not really geopolitical. So the big agency that sort of lurks in the background of all this is this um, self-described private intelligence agency called Stratfor, Strategic Forecasting,
Yeah.
that sells forecasts. And so you hire Stratfor consultants to give you briefings or to sort of consult on problems or whatever. That's how they make their money. And so part of what they do to drum up business is that like Stratfor's founder, its vice president, a lot of its associates, many of whom are the authors of these best-selling books, get into the sort of bold prediction game. And if they're right, then that's amazing. But they're not always right. And two really obvious examples of this are Stratfor's founder, George Friedman, uh, wrote a book in the 90s predicting a war with Japan, between the United States and Japan, like a physical war. And, that we're still waiting for that to happen.
I'm sure it sold well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't, but I don't know how well it sold, but it was whatever.
Yeah.
You try again next week. And Robert Kaplan, who's I think been probably the most prominent geopolitics guy in the United States. I don't know if you want to call this a bad prediction or not, but he was very important to the inside the White House push to launch the war in Iraq. And part of that was based on, I mean, just completely false predictions about what would happen if the United States invaded Iraq.
Pivot of the Middle East.
The pivot of the Middle East, right. And to his great credit, Kaplan has really acknowledged how wrong he was. I mean, to the degree that a lot of other people in the intellectual class who, cheered that war on or were instrumental in making it happen haven't. But it's a little hard. I mean, I sometimes wonder about this, when we're in the foreign policy realm, like when someone's like telling you like what's what, and then you just check like where they stood on the Iraq war, you're like, man, how seriously can we take this? Like, this is the worst decision. And a lot of people recognized it at the time. Like, people were marching in the streets about how bad of an idea it was. So that, I think that gave me a, salt shakers full of skepticism when I was reading some of this stuff.
Yeah. I guess in candor, in 2014 and 2015, I was a fellow in residence at the Center for New American Security. And I was,
tell me about that.
I was a different person then, but my office was next door to Bob Kaplan. And I treated him at that time as like a professional mentor, because this guy was writing bestsellers and I was just starting out.
And he's super smart.
And he is smart, right? And he was very kind in that mentory sense. And like, I did learn a lot from him. He gave me a bunch of advice, not so much about like writing, but it was like how to make a living as a public intellectual. And in this like national security space, it basically boiled down to like, you make a simple contrarian argument that you can get funded through grants, and then you can use that to write a proposal for a book to get an advance on royalties, like an advance contract. And then you sell it around to defense contractors and private corporations who might be interested in that idea. So you're getting money on like the front end and the back end, and you're doing one project, but you're milking it on like 3 or 4 different dimensions. And that's how you make your living. And
so let's go on. I'm sorry.
No. I want to hear what you have to say about this, because he's not wrong, but it's like, if you do that, you've kind of chosen a side in this universe,
That's right. So there's 2 things about that. One, and that I think are not just true of Kaplan, but one is you make a big contrarian claim. I think they're really good at playing that game, and they're very confident. And when you're reading some stuff, you're like, ooh, yeah, Turkey is the pivot. Like, ooh, I didn't even thought about that. You sound so sure. And then you read some of the like outdated stuff that they've written, and you're like, Jesus Christ, this is wrong.
War with Japan.
So, there is something attractive about the like bold theory, like clear prediction. I can understand the market for that, but it is not shocking when those, don't have the highest hit rate of being right. And then the other thing you said is really worth emphasizing, and you already kind of analyzed it yourself, but in that, use every part of the buffalo, like get paid for every, like get triple paid for everything you do. That's fine. I mean, like God, Lord knows writers need to get paid, but but that part of it, notice how much of it is cooperating with power, right? Like how many of those funders have a real clear take. And I don't know if it determines what kinds of things you could argue, but it does indicate that, as you said, you've chosen a side. And it might be that you were going to argue those things anyway, and you might as well get paid from like-minded people. That is a totally fine thing. I get paid by like-minded people too. But you can just see the cozy relationship to power. And I think, did you want to talk about the Stratfor thing?
Yes. So
did you know Stratfor?
I was part of this world. This is what's fucked up, and this is why this conversation is like so vital. I was part of this world, and I had interacted with them. I had no idea about like 90% of this shit. So I didn't know about the WikiLeaks stuff. Can you talk about what WikiLeaks revealed about Stratfor?
Yeah, let me just back up. So, okay, I said already that Stratfor kind of lurks in the background. That Peter Zeihan, George Friedman,
There's a social
Ian
network here.
Morris,
Yeah.
Robert Cap. Yeah, all of like the bestseller Geography is Destiny people, except for Tim Marshall, um, have worked for Stratfor and often in big ways.
Hmm.
Um, let me before we go into it, was your sense that Stratfor was like king of the hill, or was it just like a kind of struggling, like wannabe, like
No,
private
it
intelligence
was
firm with
you.
like many others?
You pegged it correctly. It was like middle. It was upper middle of the pack, but it wasn't the
Yeah.
most
Okay.
prominent, and it wasn't alone.
Yeah. And so there's a way that we can tell. So that's helpful because there's a way you can tell the story where you're like Stratfor, the private CIA, or and you're like,
Yeah,
it's kind of,
personalize it.
like a little bit, 1/8 of a CIA or something. So okay, so WikiLeaks, so some hackers hacked Stratfor, and they got 5 million emails, and then they put it on WikiLeaks. And if you wanted to know the daily lives of geopoliticians, like this was it in all its like shitty realities.
Yeah,
And a lot of it is just the daily grind of like trying to get people to buy the stuff that
the
you're
hustle.
selling,
Yeah,
and all that, right? And which is kind of, I mean, we all do it, right? But it's a little hard because part of the being like a serious geopolitician is that you're like the guru.
hmm
You're just like above it all and so wise. And of course you see these people are just hustling like anyone else. But more importantly was just it was so clear that Stratfor, I mean, not that this was a shock, but you got all the details, that Stratfor wasn't just like looking at maps and drawing wisdom, that it was really trying to put its thumb on the scale. And was one of the services it offered was monitoring activists on behalf of corporations. So like environmental activists and people who were like protesting like the oil spills, or protesting Coca-Cola. And it's not just that like they were willing to do that, which they absolutely were. It's that they would propose it. So they proposed to the Bank of America. They're like, we could investigate Glenn Greenwald for you. Would you like that? I mean, like, just think about the
that's
gall
wild.
of
Yeah,
just being like, oh man, we need some more business. I don't know. Let's propose spying on a journalist
spying
for
on
Bank of America.
leftists and
Let's see if
journalists.
Bank of
Yeah.
America is interested in that. And also some of this stuff was really gross. So there's like some George Friedman is the founder and president, was the founder and president of Stratfor. And one of the things he's like giving a female colleague advice on how to like use sex to entrap a man to get information from him. So it's like, again, you're like, is this the Coen Brothers version where everyone's an idiot and it doesn't work, but it
Private
still
CIA.
feels
Yeah.
gross? Or is this like the Born Identity version where they're actually doing this stuff? Very hard to tell. And I'm inclined to say it's the Coen Brothers version,
Wow.
where it's all a little cack-handed. But yeah, and more importantly, you just realize like this is all about power, right? This is all about like them getting access to power. One of their best things that they could sell was they had pretty good intel on Israel, about Israeli policies, and that came directly from Bibi Netanyahu. So
Mhm.
they had that connection, and they were basically peddling like, frankly, information that should have been classified from Israel, because they were very connected to Netanyahu.
Yeah, and this is wild. Like, so in their heyday, it was kind of the Bush era, and then it bled into the Obama years. But like
Yeah, yeah,
the during that window of time, for like national security people or foreign policy people, it was the era of like The Economist magazine, and it was there was no higher calling than to do some bullshit called like geopolitical risk analysis. And
yeah,
it was like Stratfor and like Eurasia Group basically were the two like they were just like the model of like what you were trying to aspire to professionally.
yeah,
And
yeah,
what people, I think what like the naive master's student who's going through an IR program, what they imagine is like they're going to do great, I don't know, risk analysis. They're going to define a new pivot on the map or something. But
yeah,
like
yeah,
a lot of the work of these places that pitch themselves as doing geopolitical risk analysis are getting a lot of their business through this weird espionage stuff and through contracts to the national security state and stuff like that. And like there was always a dark side to the success of every single one of these firms.
yeah. And it's not entirely a shock, right? They are private intelligence firms,
Yeah.
but it does suggest something that I think you can tell a little bit when you read the books, that there's a kind of information paucity to a lot of them.
Mm.
They're big on claims. They're not actually super big on detail, and to discover that the
Substantiation.
informational economy involves a lot of like there's just this like tight world of intelligence, and everyone's kind of sloshing around and like making the same claims, and and that counts as knowledge. Like that kind of is how it feels. Like if you look at the footnotes for these geopolitics books, they're very thinly sourced, and they don't like, there's a lot of like, I know, the Arabian Peninsula better than you can because I've like walked the sands, but like no one speaks any foreign languages.
Yeah.
And in some ways that's the virtue of the claim, is that you can just like from a distance, as long as you have the map, you can unlock everything.
Yeah.
Which is of course that what the hegemon wants to feel, right? Is that the world is a knowable, easily knowable place.
Yes.
So that you can go do business in all every place on the planet. I'm just skeptical about whether that's true or not.
Yeah. No, I'm with you, man. So I wonder if this is like a good time to pivot for a few minutes to the Star Wars chapter. Is that cool?
Yeah.
Did we empty the chamber on the geopolitics? I feel like we did.
Oh yeah. I mean, we can keep going, but I feel like all right, it's good.
So there is a geopolitical segue to go from the Guardian to the Star Wars thing. In 2017, I had a chapter in a book called Strategy Strikes Back, and it was a bunch of national security nerds. I was part of it, who also happened to be like Star Wars nerds, and like I think I was probably like the least into Star Wars out of everybody, to be honest. But I mean, I like it, but I'm just not like that guy. And the book was about what Star Wars could teach us about strategy. That was kind of the shtick. Very uneven edited volume, like very uneven. But in my chapter, I basically argued that the relational structure of the Galactic Republic was imperial. Like there's a core and a periphery in the Galactic Republic. There's a slave trade. There's viceroys. Coruscant's coordinates are fucking 0000. Like, and this answers the puzzle of how Palpatine could come in and like flip a fucking switch and then turn the Great Republic overnight into a great empire. Like that shouldn't be so easy, but it was. And it was easy because it was a republic in name only. That was kind of the argument I was pitching. And so there is a kind of geopolitics in Star Wars, or like astropolitics or whatever, but it's the geography of empire. It's the geography that the empire imposes on others, and like exploits in certain ways. And so like in your chapter, you really situate Star Wars in the geopolitics, not of its like own universe, but of that moment in American history. Like it's a prism on like American ideology, for lack of a better phrase. And then George Lucas is this like very fascinating cipher. There was so much in this chapter I didn't know about fucking George Lucas. And so for the top line surprise, I think for a lot of people watching Star Wars today, is that those original 3 films were basically about the Vietnam War. And if you were alive then, that probably wasn't a surprise, but like for contemporary watchers, that could be fucking completely novel. How do we know that that's the case? And like, what made it a Vietnam War film?
Well, let me just back up and kind of endorse what you're saying. There's a reason that you can watch Star Wars and be like, I want to think through strategy with Star Wars, because Star Wars is about U.S. foreign policy. And it is, the reason the reverse mapping works is that the first mapping was there in the first place. So funny. George Lucas, I mean, he's explicit. This is not a mystery. I'm not like making a kind of interpretive reach here. George Lucas was fascinated with the Vietnam War. He had already been making movies that refer to it, that deal with it, that sometimes are set in Vietnam. And he saw Star Wars as not set in a galaxy far, far away, but as part of that cinematic universe that he was developing, not just ones of, droids and Jedi and that kind of thing, but it was consonant with other movies he was making, like American Graffiti 2, which is partly set in Vietnam, and a third very important film that he was working on, Apocalypse Now. George Lucas was the original slated director, writer of Apocalypse Now, and it was only because he couldn't get it made. Francis Ford Coppola was a friend of his. They were both working at the same studio at the same time, but he couldn't get it made through Hollywood, that he finally gave it up, handed it over to Coppola, and then He said, I felt comfortable doing that because I could just fold my ideas from Apocalypse Now into Star Wars. So if you want to know what George Lucas's Apocalypse Now looks like, it doesn't look that different from Star Wars. He saw them as kind of, he saw Star Wars as a mutation of his Apocalypse Now movie.
So Jesus. So Star Wars is a galactic apocalypse now. With
Yes,
fuzzy
my article is
bears.
called The Galactic Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, just the fuzzy bears thing. So you're like, okay, in what sense is this Vietnam? He's like, well, okay, my understanding of Vietnam is that as a technological superpower coming up against a quote unquote primitive people.
Mm-hmm.
And, and you're like, well, that is what happens in Star Wars. And the battle on Endor, the one with the Ewoks, that was originally slated to be in the first Star Wars film. That was the big set piece. So it got moved to the third one. But that was the thing that was in Apocalypse Now, right? That was going to be the scene. And which is bizarre because if you think about how that plays out in Return of the Jedi in the third Star Wars film, it is, big high-tech empire, trying to extirpate all these, local coded as indigenous people, trying to mow them down. But it fails. It fails because these people the Ewoks armed with like slingshots, and other kind of Stone Age technology, are able to take down a massive empire. So this is literally this is the Viet Cong. Like that's exactly the mapping that Lucas had in his mind. But here's the crazy thing: you're cheering for them the whole way. You're like, yes, take them out. And it's in a very, like at surface level at least, Star Wars films are anti-imperialist. It's called, Republic versus the Empire.
Yeah.
But for Lucas, the United States is the empire.
He says that at some point too,
Yeah,
right? Like
he
it's
does. He
not
says it a few
ambiguous.
times. No, right. So he says a few, like Alderaan, with the planet gets vaporized. That's like North Vietnam for him. The Emperor's throne room, Lucas insists, is based on the Oval Office. I don't really see the resemblance, but he was very insistent about that. The Emperor, he insisted, was Nixon. So yeah, this is not
Jeez.
This is not hidden.
All the way down.
And it goes deep. It goes deep, and it goes deep on the other side, because if you think about who the heroes are, they're not just the Ewoks. They are the Jedi. And you kind of originally Lucas wanted them all played by Asian actors. Asia being the site of a lot of the U.S. imperial adventures. I mean, right? Would that have been better?
Yeah.
But if you just take a second and defamiliarize Star Wars for yourself, like, because we just know it too well to think about it, but the Jedi are actually very Asian. So Jedi comes from a Japanese word. Yoda, Obi-Wan Kenobi, these are Japanese sounding words. Han Solo, that's the largest ethnicity in China. Their dress, a lot of their religion is not an accurate representation of Asian religions, but comes a lot through Lucas's reading of Zen. So I mean, he really sees all of that, right? So he really sees the Jedi as, colonized Asia, and the Empire as, the hubristic, technologically overdeveloped United States.
That's some mind-blowing shit, especially because it's like sitting right there in front of us in our popular imagination. Like, what you have this profound point that is true, but I hadn't quite thought of it this way. The Vietnam War, when I picture it in my mind's eye, it's like some schmo who doesn't want to be there, who's like slopping through rice paddies in the jungle, like hard on the ground counterinsurgency. And you make the point that it was actually, for the U.S., it was a high-tech war. What made it a high-tech war? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so a lot of the hopeful kind of initial fighting of the war, and that was the kind that was publicized by people like McNamara, was that the United States was going to win because it had, bombers with wingspan the size of football fields. I mean, just the amount of technology that was brought to this war was absolutely extraordinary, and especially when the United States was trying to protect its own troops by swapping in tech for troops. That just handled through, air power. And there were also, we don't remember this part about the Vietnam War, but there's all these experiments with like remote sensors and like, ways to detect, the movement of precision bombs. So a scene that I don't think of as like having a clear Vietnam resonance, but I, reading reviews from the time I came to understand it, that it did, is that whole scene where Luke has the targeting system, like this really advanced targeting system, and he eventually rejects it for this, organic force, use the force Luke. But people at the time saw all that targeting shit, and they were like, oh yeah, that's like these are all the targeting systems that the United States is using in Vietnam. That was like a clear resonance that's become more opaque with time.
That's funny. Um, what was it in Lucas's filmography that would have foreshadowed him making Star Wars? Or like could you see this coming?
Yeah, you kind of could. So he did. I mean, I see them all as connected. So the first film he does is THX 1138. I may be transposing some of those numerals, but it's a dystopian, like really just like shrill. I don't know, if shrill is a perhaps a word. Harsh kind of leftist take on a future where of like state violence where humans are basically prisoners and they have to work, and then they're kind of chilled out with like pleasure pods just to like keep them docile, and the whole thing is enforced by this robot police army that looks exactly like the stormtroopers.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of a hard movie to watch. It's like such a bummer. It's like one of these like 1984 meets Brave New World movies. And Lucas himself kind of picked up on that. He was like, oh yeah, my social critique is right, he thought, but people don't like to watch movies that are bummers. So he's like, I'm going to make feel good movies that
Yeah.
have my politics. And the first one he does is this movie called American Graffiti, which is like this, nostalgia, one crazy night film. If you've seen Slacker or Dazed and Confused or Booksmart, it's all the same genre. And Lucas, really did a wonderful version of it. And it's on the one hand, like such a like feel good nostalgia bath. And like you hear all this music from the 50s and you're back in Lucas's childhood where everyone was like racing cars up and down the strip. And so you think, okay, well, where's the political edge here? And it's right at the end. So like the whole movie happens and you're just like, oh man, childhood was great. Or like being a teenager was great. I hate being an adult. And then he just like gives you the end of the movie, and he's like, he does one of those shots where or one of those title cards where he's like, and this is what happens to all these characters. And like, it is so unpleasant because because it's like one of them dies in Vietnam, one of them like leaves the country for Canada, like and it's just you're
Holy
just
shit!
like, oh
Yeah,
god,
I've never
yeah,
seen it.
you just see the Vietnam War descending.
Yeah.
You realize, oh, not just these people are like about to go to college, it's they're about to get drafted, and this is just the moment when they don't have to think about that. But you all, because you're watching this movie in the 70s, you're like, I know what's going to happen to this generation. Holy shit. So it's a
Yeah.
movie that is it's not a Vietnam film, but it really is a Vietnam film. But with you're kind of drawn into the feel good thing, and that's how Star Wars works, right? Star Wars has you critiquing the Empire, but from a position of like, from the cheering stands, like, rooting for the Ewoks, rooting for the Jedi. It feels so good to watch that movie. But there's a little interesting political sleight of hand because it's a weird movie, because if you actually like unpack the politics, you're like, wait, who am I rooting for?
Yeah.
And it's very effective and powerful in that way. And I think it's not a shock that a lot of people, particularly on the left, kind of connected with Star Wars in ways that are hard to fully explain, but that's part of how we use the language of Star Wars, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Force and all that kind of. I mean, those metaphors are really alive for us.
Wow. Yeah. And I hadn't seen American Graffiti. My uncle was actually an extra in American Graffiti too, incidentally. But
In American, the second American Graffiti,
second one, yeah,
the sequel.
which
Oh yeah, I'm
I
very
also
into the
haven't
sequel.
seen. But
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
one that was in, or he went to Vietnam or something.
Oh yeah. So I mean, not tech. They didn't film it in Vietnam, but it's the one Vietnam film that Lucas did. So it's a
Overtly
montage
Vietnam.
film. Yeah, there's like he follows four different character arcs. It deals with the unpleasantness of the sequel, that is foreshadowed at the very end of American Graffiti. And so there's one character arc where the kind of dweeb character goes to Vietnam and like never comes back. And it's filmed, I mean, fictively, it's filmed in Vietnam. And Lucas directed that part, the Vietnam part, and used the film techniques that he wanted to use for Apocalypse Now. He wanted this grainy documentary. So you can actually see a kind of preview along with Star Wars about what Lucas was going to do with Apocalypse Now from the Terry sequence in American Graffiti 2.
Wow. What? Just as a sidebar, like, why did he come off of Apocalypse Now?
So the way that my understanding is that, I mean, film studios were really against critical wars, films about the Vietnam War for a while. So there's this efflorescence of those films in the late 70s. Taxi Driver, Rolling Thunder, Star Wars, Apocalypse Now, just like all of them suddenly come out at once. But until that moment, it was really hard to get a movie made. So Lucas is in the moment when you can't get that movie made. Then he moves to Star Wars. Then Coppola slides in at when the window is open. But that has a lot to do with Lucas's enduring hatred of the other stand-in for the Empire, which is the studio system, the capitalists. And a lot of his understanding of what he was doing as a film producer was to wrench power away from Southern California and implant it in Northern California, which was, of course, the place of the counterculture and bearded figures like him who would oppose the war.
Yeah, that's so. I live a couple hours away from one of the only redwood forests outside of Northern California in New Zealand.
Okay.
And every time I go there, I think about Endor and the redwoods. Return of the Jedi.
Yeah.
And this observation, it seems like, is I always wondered, like, why did they film it? Why is the redwoods in California the location for Endor? It's such a unique thing. Like, I don't even know if anyone else has done anything like that. But, like, it seems like the answer is this Northern versus Southern California fight in Lucas's mind. No, like this is like
no, that's very good.
Against the Hollywood studio thing.
Yeah, that's very good. And there's another component to it, which is the Ewoks are named after the Miwok tribal nation, which is also from Northern California. The other component of this is that part of, taking power away from Southern California, from Hollywood, is investing in computer technologies, right? Because suddenly you don't need all those like sound stages and all that kind of stuff if you can do CGI, which was, over the hill for Star Wars. Like, they weren't able to do it for the original Star Wars, but Lucas invested heavily in this. And we think of now as CGI as like, this is the face of capital, but it was initially, it was supposed to be like hackers and, computer guys in garages who were, much like, Han Solo tinkering on the Millennium Falcon, who were had technology that didn't look pretty but worked, that was cheap, that could take power away from, the Death Star in Southern California.
Yeah. How would you describe Lucas's politics in the 70s? Like, Star Wars shows him to be anti-war, but also kind of a techno-utopian. I mean, like, how do you unpack that?
Okay, so the tech stuff, I mean, Star Wars is all about tech, right? And one way that you can code or interpret the Star Wars conflict is between high tech and low tech. So the bad guys have this like gleaming, incredibly expensive technology that, by the way, never quite works because it's too much, And then the good guys they always have this secondhand or stolen technology. They're always working on it physically. There's grease marks everywhere. You can see the physical manifestations of labor. They're always holding rags. Even like Princess Leia has an arc welder at one point. Like, they're always repairing things, right? Everything's breaking, they're always repairing it. So there's a very humanistic element which Lucas associates with the car culture that he grew up in, which was kind of like the last days of disco of car culture, of like back when men, even as they were getting like fired from the auto plants, could still like work to tinker on their own cars before deindustrialization carried a lot of those jobs overseas. So he's really rooting for. So on the one hand, you get the like low tech guys. On the other hand, you get the no tech people, like either the Ewoks, or you get the like, upper level Jedi who are just, all they have is swords, in a world run by blasters, which is like a total throwback to all these like Japanese films that are ambivalent about modernization, where like the samurai have swords and the bad guys have guns. So you can tell like we think of Star Wars as like big high tech, like, fanfare, but actually the guy is, and he says that he's like, I'm not a big technological guy. I'm pretty phobic about technology, and you can see that in the Star Wars universe.
That's fascinating. It's easy enough to see. You've even said this explicitly already. Like, Star Wars is anti-imperialist. Like, that's the easiest read of it. And you suggest that it's anti-imperialist also, though, in like a particularly orientalizing way. And you
I don't want to. I'm glad we're talking about this. I don't want to ride that horse too far. I describe it as a sort of solipsistic anti-imperialism. So it's on the one hand, there's something really interesting, possibly powerful, about Lucas coming out against, his own government and the foreign policy of his own country. I mean, this is after a decade plus of Vietnam War related protests from a lot of people, so it's not entirely a
in the culture.
Lonely message to be. It's in the culture, but it's still pretty amazing that a movie like that gets made gets like taken that seriously. It's extraordinary. However, there's a few different ways to be anti-imperialist, and one would be kind of sympathy for and interest and curiosity about the victims of imperialism,
Centering
and that
them,
is,
or yeah.
yeah, in some way, or their voices, whatever. Boy, that's not what you get from Lucas. So I like, for me, the key is the pivot is American Graffiti 2, where he actually like does Vietnam, and like George Lucas goes to Vietnam. So what does that look like? Bitter criticism of the war, and what it has done to the people who fought it.
Mm-hmm.
There is not. This is set in Vietnam, about Vietnam. There's not a single Vietnamese person depicted in that. Lucas's version of Vietnam is just a theater of agony for white people. Do you know what I mean? It's like the reason that the Vietnam War is bad for Lucas is not what it did to Vietnam. It's what it did to the United States. And look, you can have that objection. Like the Vietnam War was arguably very bad for the United States, and that is a perspective to have. But if you think about like, okay, now in Star Wars, like the Empire does some pretty messed up stuff, including blowing up a whole planet, Alderaan.
Yeah.
We get no moral information about that. We never meet anyone from Alderaan except for Princess Leia, who seems to forget about all of that within like a scene.
That's true.
You never get a sense of like actually what happened there, or like what it meant. All you're just like, oh man, the Empire, they're
lost a planet.
Very bad. They just did a hardcore genocide, right? And then the whole thing becomes this question about, can you have redemption in the Skywalker family? And it's about the son and father relationship. And the happy news at the end of the trilogy is that like Anakin is like, does a kind of final act of like side switching, and then he's like, you see him again at the end as a Force ghost smiling next to Yoda and Obi-Wan. And on the one hand, you're like, that's great, man. Everyone can be redeemed. Like son redeems the father. Wouldn't that be the nice story of like the generational clash, that George Lucas was living through? On the other hand, you're like, Anakin's a good guy? The dude fucking blew up a planet. Like he killed 1 billion people. I'm just guessing. I don't know. They never give you a body count, but that's not obviously wrong. Killed 1 billion people. And at the end, he was a little helpful to like taking out the Emperor. We appreciate that. But like, I don't think this guy is still a war criminal. Yeah. He is still like worse than Hitler. Like, it is just, but for Lucas, like that doesn't even come up. You're like, because it's really a story about the moral, like how is it to morally live in a country that has done immoral things? That's the question that Lucas has. And so he really is about the cruelty of U.S. foreign relations, but he's also about the redemption of the U.S. national character. And, there's got to be a way to make this okay. We're not really bad people. And that's the story of Star Wars. That's why it feels so good, right? For a generation that's been really dispirited after the Vietnam War, is like the feel-good message is like, you can get your glory back. Like, yes, you did some fucked up things, but like, we forgive you. So it's anti-imperialist, but like with a twist.
Yeah, with the like, we don't care about I mean, like you take your eye off of planetary genocide so that you can focus on like, well, does it work out with Special Boy? Does Special Boy have it his way? Like,
what are Anakin's feelings? Or Luke's feelings? Exactly. No, totally. And that's kind of how the Star Wars universe runs. And look, a lot of people have noted that a lot of what's in Star Wars, I mean, there's just a lot of really kind of crude racial stereotypes sometimes transposed. So Chewbacca is obviously, I mean, George Lucas says he's the trusty native. He's the like Tonto figure, and it's pretty clear to read him as indigenous. The droids, a lot of that stuff comes, and like, he's the only one who doesn't, not a potential love object for Princess Leia. The droids are sort of minstrel figures. There's a lot of ways in which Lucas's understanding of the world, even if critical of U.S. foreign policy, is not exactly alive to the full subjectivities of other people outside of the United States, or even outside of, the white, like the white part of the United States.
It's very revealing because he was, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but he was kind of like a man of the new left. And yet,
it really is.
And yet there's all this racialized shit, and like Lando is a traitor, and like
the one black guy in Star Wars. No, that's right. I mean, so let's take both those parts seriously. He really is a guy of the left. And like, you're like, you picture Lucas in your mind. You're like a young guy, in the 70s in, California, in a beard. And if you just put those things together, you're like, oh yeah, that's what the left looked like.
Yeah.
So he's totally he's a countercultural figure who was making
yeah.
avant-garde films before he made Star Wars. Like he's all that, and he has the kind of blindness and narcissism that is not atypical of baby boomers on the left. We all have our blindnesses, and he's like he's got his generations like real hard.
That's one of the fascinating things that you're doing here. Like you're dissecting a universally recognized pop culture object, but it's like as a way into what were the beliefs and blind spots in those beliefs of that snapshot of that generation. I mean, and then like what does that say about us? It's some deep work, man.
Thanks, man.
What one last kind of like, I don't know, maybe a big question. What do you make of the fact, and this gets back to this strategy strikes back thing that I did, like I'm not like a national security guy in the way that I used to be. Like I'm extremely critical. I'm a man of the left, right? But these war-obsessed military guys, like people who are overt militarists, right, who give their lives to supporting an imperial politics overtly, they are also the biggest fanboys of this story that shows them to be the bad guy, right? Yeah. And it's like even more so in the Andor. I don't know if you've seen that. Like that, it's even more so with that because it's like a kind of like a revolutionary critique in a way. What is the disconnect there? Like, how does Star Wars be anti-imperial and yet people who have an imperial politics more or less are like the ones celebrating it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the disquieting thing about Star Wars is that on the one hand, you're like, wow, this is like film, if you think about it, is actually really interesting in what it has to say. And then you're like, it is so popular with the imperialists, like, including like Ronald Reagan, like was a big fan of Star Wars. And you're just like, does he not get it? And that I think is where the solipsism matters, because I think George Lucas, gives you the critique, but then gives you the out, right? He's like, U.S. foreign policy, it was bad, but like we can, it's like we can get our groove back.
Yeah, we can do
better.
And
so it's really easy for people to be like, yeah, I'm one of the rebels, and look, the big tragedy of Lucas's life, and frankly, probably the tragedy of his entire generation, and if we live long enough through climate change, I'm sure will be the tragedy of mine as well, is like he starts out thinking he starts out driving the Millennium Falcon, but by the end of the day, he's driving the Death Star, and so, like.
You like live long enough to see yourself become
yeah I mean like it's like, what is he? He's like this like scrappy, like we're gonna like make films our own way kind of guy, and now suddenly everyone has to make films.
He's the hegemon.
Yeah, he's totally the hegemon, right? And he doesn't, does he get it? I don't know. Anyway, so but I think part of it, like part of what makes Star Wars work is it's forgiving, the critique and then the forgiveness, right? Which is really flattering to power, and then everyone can kind of tell themselves that they're the rebels, even when they're like in Lucas's own estimation, even when they're the dark side.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that this kind of pop culture stuff has a political impact or can have a political impact if it's able to be read both ways, like in extreme ways?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, I certainly know that a lot of people use Star Wars as a metaphor to think through situations in their political lives. Like, I'm not joking about that. I mean, this. Like, we use it in speech. You're just like, yeah, no, this is the moment when I'm doing it. Really fighting off the dark side right now. And so you can't help but. I mean, one theory would be that all these films are just decorative, and we live our lives however we want to, and then we find the films that kind of fit the facts. Another theory would be, no, we actually are profoundly shaped by culture. These narratives matter a lot. They certainly feel like they matter a lot to us. So what kinds of narratives we serve up, what kind we accept, those shape our subjectivities. I'm inclined toward that thing, but you're right. I pointed out that Star Wars is ambivalent enough that it can go multiple ways. And I think that might be a source of its popularity, but then that limits its ability to serve as a left text if it's so accommodating of the right as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Dude, this has been so fun. I really appreciate this. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. This is, the audience will love it. Just as I do. Thanks so much.
Great, fantastic. Okay.